Gerald Bull wasn't a warlord, he wasn't a general, he wasn't a terrorist mastermind. He was an engineer. But by the spring of 1990, that title meant very little, because Bull had done something far more dangerous than lead an army. He'd handed Saddam Hussein a dream. A long-range, unconventional weapon so ambitious, so deliberately masked that stopping it became an international priority, not through sanctions, not through diplomacy, but through silence.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Through erasure. And that's exactly what happened. Project Babylon was never meant to be public. It existed in the shadows, carefully structured, meticulously hidden behind shell companies and industrial-sounding contracts. The pieces of the gun were commissioned under false pretenses, disguised as ordinary components. Long steel barrels that were for oil drilling, hydraulic assemblies that were for civil engineering. On paper, everything looked legal, routine. That was the brilliance of it, and the danger. Because what Bull was actually building was a supergun, a massive artillery system that could fire projectiles or satellites hundreds of miles. It was being constructed in parts across Europe and North America and shipped discreetly to Iraq, not as a single weapon but as industrial cargo with no obvious military use. Until, of course, the parts were all in one place. Bull had been working toward this idea for years. His early research with the High Altitude Research Project proved that launching objects into near space using giant guns wasn't science fiction. He had the credentials, the data, and the obsession. But after losing support from Western governments and dealing with legal trouble over unauthorized weapons sales, Bull had no illusions about where his work would be applied next. And Iraq offered him everything he wanted: funding, resources, and total control. What Iraq wanted in return was reach. They didn't just want weapons that could hit their neighbors. They wanted tools that would give them psychological dominance. A supergun wasn't just about military effectiveness. It was about spectacle, a demonstration of technological might that would leave Israel, Iran, and the West guessing what Iraq might be capable of next. But Bull's project didn't go unnoticed, not by Mossad, not by Western intelligence. He had already drawn attention during his time working with South Africa's military, a country then under international sanctions. His name was flagged, his contracts scrutinized, and the moment he aligned himself with Saddam's regime, surveillance escalated. Mossad knew exactly what they were looking at. Bull's design was unconventional but feasible. His procurement operation was legally murky but brilliantly structured. And once parts started moving across borders, Israeli intelligence made its move. In March 1990, British customs intercepted a shipment of massive steel tubes at T-Sport. These weren't ordinary pipes, they were unmistakably supergun barrel segments. Too large, too precise, too suspicious. It was the smoking gun, literally. And once that shipment was seized, the dominoes started to fall. Other shipments were intercepted. Front companies were exposed. The web Bull had built to conceal his work started to unravel. Suddenly, contractors who thought they were building industrial equipment realized what they'd been a part of. The illusion collapsed, and Iraq's most ambitious weapons project began crumbling from the outside in. But the story doesn't end with paperwork. Because on March 22, just weeks after the T-Sport seizure, Gerald Bull was found dead outside his apartment in Brussels. 5 bullets, no witnesses, no sign of a struggle, no robbery, just a clean, professional execution. Belgian authorities opened a case, but the investigation stalled. No suspects, no arrests, and no answers. But to those in the intelligence world, the message was obvious. Mossad had been watching Bull for years. They had motive, they had opportunity, and they had every reason to make sure Project Babylon died with him. Killing Bull wasn't just about ending a project. It was about sending a message, a signal to any other scientist or engineer considering similar deals with rogue states. There are no safe contracts when the work threatens national survival. And the timing couldn't have been more strategic. The seizure of the gun parts exposed the operation. The assassination ensured it would never be resurrected. After Bull's death, Iraq never completed the supergun. Without its mastermind, the technical knowledge was irreplaceable. The remaining parts were either destroyed, confiscated, or rendered useless without the rest of the assembly. And by the time the Gulf War began, coalition forces confirmed that Project Babylon had been fully neutralized. What they found in Iraq wasn't a weapon ready to fire, it was the ruins of ambition, fragmented components, blueprints, hints of a terrifying capability that never reached its final form. And while analysts later concluded that the supergun wouldn't have had practical battlefield utility, it was too big, too fixed, too vulnerable, it still posed a strategic threat. A psychological one. The idea that Iraq could launch an attack across borders without missiles, without planes, was destabilizing enough to demand intervention. And that's what makes Bull's story so significant, not because the weapon worked, but because it almost did. The deeper issue exposed by Project Babylon wasn't about one gun. It was about how easily global trade systems can be manipulated for weapons development. Bull didn't build the supergun in a single country. He used the world. He used its loopholes, its lack of coordination, its blind spots. Pipes, pistons, pressure gauges, all legal, all regulated only loosely. But when assembled in secret, they became the core of something much more dangerous. That's why the international response went beyond one assassination. Governments reevaluated their export controls. Intelligence agencies began sharing more data on scientific personnel, not just materials. Customs officials were trained to spot suspicious patterns in industrial orders. The concept of dual-use technology, items with both civilian and military applications, became central to arms control policy. Bull's death wasn't the end of a conspiracy. It was the beginning of a new era in counterproliferation. Because the truth is, in modern warfare, the battlefield isn't just land or air, it's logistics, procurement, intellectual capital. And Bull proved that a single mind, if left unchecked, could create global instability without a single shot fired. That's the legacy, a weapon that never launched, a project that was never completed, and a man who became a threat not because of what he did, but because of what he knew. And if you're still wondering whether the assassination was justified, there's no easy answer. It depends on where you stand, on how you weigh legality versus necessity, on whether you believe threats should be stopped by courts or covert action. What's undeniable is that Bull's erasure was effective, cold, precise, and final. And the world has operated differently ever since. If you found this story as staggering as we did, hit like, share it with someone who loves uncovering the hidden mechanics of global power plays, and make sure you're subscribed for more breakdowns like this. And tell us, do you think the elimination of Gerald Bull prevented a greater disaster or crossed a line that should never be normalized? Let's talk about it below. Gerald Bull didn't get a trial, he didn't get a chance to explain himself. There was no press conference, no breaking news cycle, no courtroom debate about ethics or national security. He got 5 bullets in the back and the quiet agreement of governments that understood exactly what he was and why he had to go. Because in the world of shadow warfare, some people are too dangerous to leave alive. And Bull, by 1990, had crossed every silent boundary. He wasn't building a conventional weapon. He was designing a system that sidestepped missile treaties, outmaneuvered arms embargoes, and dared to reimagine modern warfare using outdated tools. A cannon. A gun so massive and so precise that it could, in theory, fire satellites into orbit, or more realistically, flatten targets across borders from hundreds of miles away. To him, it was science. To the rest of the world, it was escalation. By the time Iraq partnered with him to develop Project Babylon, Gerald Bull wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was a one-man threat vector, a mobile weapons program, and Mossad had been watching for years. Long before the gun parts started turning up in shipping ports, long before customs officials knew what they were looking at, Israeli intelligence had already tagged Bull as a person of interest. His work with South Africa during apartheid, already a diplomatic nightmare, had drawn attention. But it was the Iraqi connection that turned concern into action. Because Iraq wasn't just developing technology, it was sending a message. A weapon like Project Babylon was never purely about function. Yes, the gun could technically reach Israel, and yes, the firepower would have been devastating, but its real power? Intimidation. Just having it would force every country in the region to recalculate. It would redraw red lines. And that couldn't be allowed. But stopping it wouldn't be easy. The project wasn't built in a single lab or bunker. It was outsourced, distributed across companies, hidden in shipping manifests, and covered with layers of international contracts. That was the genius of Bull's operation. He didn't hide the gun, he disguised it. And the components? Totally legal, each individual part could be justified. Industrial machinery, high-grade steel, hydraulic components, they didn't scream weapon. They looked like mining equipment, oil rig supplies, construction tools. Bull knew how to build quietly. That's what made him so dangerous. So intelligence agencies didn't wait for the gun to be assembled. They tracked the movement of parts. They followed the financial paper trails. And when British Customs intercepted the oversized pipes at T-Sport in March 1990, the game was up. The pieces didn't just fit together, they confirmed the nightmare scenario. What followed was swift. The international community, already on edge due to Iraq's rising aggression, moved to shut the project down. Shipments were stopped, export licenses revoked, contracts investigated, and Bull, he became a liability too large to manage. On March 22, just days after the shipment seizure, Gerald Bull was assassinated in Brussels. Shot 5 times with a silenced weapon in the hallway of his apartment building. No fingerprints, no struggle, nothing stolen, just a dead man and a very clear message. The investigation went nowhere. Belgian police had no suspects and no one stepped forward, but in intelligence circles it was widely understood Mossad had acted. And they had done so with purpose. Killing Bull accomplished several things at once. First, it dismantled Project Babylon. The technical expertise, his designs, his calculations, his ability to turn raw metal into a strategic weapon was gone. No one could replace him. Iraq had the parts but not the mind. Second, it warned others, scientists, engineers, private consultants. If you work with regimes that threaten regional stability, your passport and your paycheck won't protect you. You might not get a second chance, you might not even get a first warning. And finally, it reminded everyone watching that intelligence isn't just about information, it's about outcomes. Bull's death wasn't about punishment, it was about prevention. The aftermath confirmed it. When coalition forces moved into Iraq during the Gulf War, they found remnants of the supergun. Segmented barrels, recoil assemblies, technical drawings, all of it was real, but none of it was functional because the project had been killed before it was completed. Analysts reviewed the designs and concluded the same thing. The gun was technically brilliant but strategically flawed. It couldn't be moved, it couldn't be hidden, it was vulnerable to airstrikes and couldn't be deployed in multiple theaters. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the message the gun sent. That message had to be stopped, and it was. And while Bull's assassination was never officially claimed, it remains one of the clearest examples of what happens when state intelligence decides to enforce the rules outside the law. Because this wasn't just about a weapon, it was about a warning. And that warning still stands. In the decades since, governments have tightened controls on dual-use technologies. Export regulations have expanded. Intelligence sharing across borders has increased. And the world has learned that the next Gerald Bull might not come with a military rank or a political ideology, just an engineering degree and a list of clients willing to pay. That's why the legacy of Project Babylon isn't about the gun. It's about the shift it caused in how the world views technological proliferation. Bull showed us that brilliance without boundaries is dangerous. That knowledge, when sold without ethics, can destabilize entire regions. And that sometimes stopping an idea means stopping the person who created it. Because in the end, that's what Project Babylon was, an idea. And like all dangerous ideas, it was erased before it could become a reality. Bull's death didn't spark outrage, it sparked silence. A quiet, collective understanding among governments that something had been avoided, that a scenario too risky to allow had been quietly neutralized. And if that sounds cold, it is. But that's the nature of the world Gerald Bull walked into. He believed in science, he believed in pushing limits. But he forgot that the limits he was pushing weren't just physical, they were political, moral, global. He crossed those lines with confidence, and someone made sure he never crossed them again. Gerald Bull didn't leave behind a war, he left behind a question. How far should someone be allowed to go in the name of science? And who gets to decide when they've gone too far? Because Bull wasn't some cartoonish villain building weapons in a lair. He was a man who genuinely believed in his work. To him, Project Babylon wasn't an instrument of destruction, it was the culmination of a lifetime of research, a technological monument to possibility. He didn't see it as a threat, he saw it as progress, as proof that he had been right all along. But the world didn't see a monument, they saw a weapon. And in the eyes of intelligence services, context is everything. Gerald Bull didn't just build a supergun, he built it for Saddam Hussein, for a regime already engaged in regional aggression, already in violation of international norms, and already one step away from sparking a broader conflict. That context changed everything. In a vacuum, Bull's supergun might have ended up in a museum. In Iraq, under Saddam, it became something else entirely. That's why Mossad and likely others didn't wait for the first shell to be fired. The risk wasn't just about whether the weapon would work. It was about the fact that someone was building it at all, outside of any international oversight, without any checks, for a regime that thrived on threats. And once British authorities intercepted those barrel segments in March 1990, the game was over. The weapon was exposed, the threat was public, and the man behind it had nowhere left to hide. Bull's assassination just days later wasn't an act of war, it was an act of containment. His death halted the project, scattered its collaborators, and put a full stop at the end of a sentence that had been building quietly for years. And it did so without the need for a single bomb to be dropped or a declaration to be made. It was, from a strategic standpoint, brutally effective. But that doesn't make it clean, or easy, or comfortable. Because when a state decides to kill someone without trial, without process, without due diligence, it enters dangerous territory. The kind of territory where law bends to urgency and morality gets weighed against consequences. And that's what makes the Bull case so fascinating and so disturbing. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about stopping an idea before it took shape. The gun didn't need to be loaded. The fact that it existed at all was enough. And Gerald Bull, brilliant as he was, had become too volatile to leave alone. That reality reshaped the way the world thought about weapons proliferation. Before Project Babylon, the focus was on missiles, warheads, launch sites. But Bull's operation showed that a weapon didn't need to look like a weapon to become a threat. It could be disguised, distributed, hidden in trade routes and business deals, and the man who built it could appear completely legitimate until the moment he was. So after Bull's death, governments adjusted. Export controls got tighter, customs enforcement got sharper. The concept of dual-use technology became a core issue for national security. Suddenly, engineers, researchers, and consultants were on watch lists, not for what they'd done but for what they might do. Because if one man could bring the world to the edge using only legal contracts and engineering specs, then the game had changed completely. Bull's supergun never fired, his project never launched, but the ripple effect of his ambition is still being felt. In policy, in intelligence strategy, in the quiet calculus of risk and prevention that guides shadow decisions every day. He's gone, the gun is gone, but the questions remain. And so does the precedent. If this story grabbed you the way it grabbed us, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear how far ambition can go before it gets stopped cold, and hit subscribe for more truth beneath the surface stories like this. And tell us in the comments, was Gerald Bull just too smart for his own good, or did he cross a line no one should ever dare approach? Let's get into it.